When we were chatting earlier on, I made an example of there is no end state to inclusion. Inclusion is a continuously evolving journey, so the more we continue to evolve and include, the more we are able to serve even more clients.
Yeah, you give me an example to give in that, when they first built the 1 mile, like the 1 mile time, and somebody did it, and the world was like, wow. But we noticed that 10 days later, somebody broke it. And since then, almost tens of thousands have done beyond. So like you're saying, it's a journey, and people, if you build on something, people will always better that. And that's the attitude we want to see from corporates, from global leaders, from government, from NGOs, and in the communities at large. And secondly,
sorry to interrupt you there, Simon. I think also want to interject about that critical point where around the fact that there is no end point, there is also no fault and no doubt in terms of also not being overwhelmed. We need to assess ourselves, and that's the role of an inclusion assessment, right? Is to say, where are you in terms of maturity? But it's never too late to start. Yes. And the intention is the starting point.
Exactly.
The intention and the why, as well as the measurable targets, are then what really catapults the progression from low maturity to then the levels of an organization like Accenture that you were saying has scored 100% for the last 8 years. But Accenture themselves have had their journey. It's been an ongoing journey, and a journey that continues to evolve and progress till today. So even within Accenture, we're not at the end.
I'm sure even this is 8 years, 100%, meaning that before that,
absolutely,
it was below that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you have to start, and you have to keep building on the mistakes and everything.
Absolutely.
And you've seen that there's a proliferation of a lot of talk discussion groups, organizations like the government to government G20. Under that, you have the Disability 20. Then we have the Zero Project. And these are organizations that are recently formed because of the global movements. And we talking about the global movements, Accenture being one of the members of the Valuable 500, we have had an opportunity where Africa Techon as an organization has really looked at it and they say, hey, we can't have just a local discussion, localized. We also need the good practices that are happening across the world. And let's adopt the Valuable 50 and bring it home. And this is a vision to start with the 50 top corporates that have a disability inclusion policy or approach. And with your experience, how can the local leaders, corporate leaders, learn from these global conversations around disability inclusion?
So I often say that it's really good and important, to think global, but localization is always so critical, and some of the approaches, it's really just starting with the dialogues, so like the upcoming conference, where we are creating a platform for local leaders and players in the disability inclusion space and corporate environment to actually be sitting around the room, and we discuss our own local nuances in terms of the challenges. But because there's the global angle, what I love about often working and looking at global practices, it's we usually don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to localize and make sure that we are leveraging the local relevance, and our local nuances. So the main thing is for leaders, I think, one, the curiosity and the commitment, so commit to wanting to see the progress, commit to an end target, start somewhere, and measure that progress year on year, and education. So educate people, educate ourselves as leaders. You know, there's a lot of discomfort still in South Africa around disability. And the discomfort is not necessarily as a result of ignorance, but it's fear. So by educating ourselves and educating people, that's how we make progress. That's how we change narratives. And ongoing conversations like podcasts like this, you know, where we really do create the opportunity for us to speak about these very important topics and dispel some of the myths where people might think it's unachievable in South Africa. Here's a company in South Africa, here are people, here are NGOs that have done it in South Africa, and it started with the will and the commitment and the passion.
They say a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step.
Absolutely.
And the stepping is the issue. Just outline from your experience, what 2 steps can be taken by the local corporate leaders just to reach to the lower hanging fruits and start on the journey? Just to maybe outline 2 examples.
So I think the first one is collectively, you know, working together to say, maybe let's start with the 2%. You know, to say I want to start with the 2% representation in my organization. The valuable 50 we speak about, let them commit to that as a starting point. And a horizon in terms of by when do we want to achieve this, with a roadmap of the how we want to achieve this. And the how, we've got many examples, you know, and sharing things around inclusive hiring, building safety in organizations, you know, and just measuring that ongoing progress. If it's 5 years, every year there needs to be the target for that specific year that we then measure. You know, as I said earlier on, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. You know, and that continuous, again, I'll say, the conversation where we all hold each other accountable. So how do the valuable 50, for example, what is the platform to hold everyone accountable that we are making this progress year on year towards that 2%?
In talking about the steps to take, you might find that people choke, and stage fright comes in as a result of fear. And what would you advise, what would you point out as the common misconception on disability inclusion programs that people are scared to go beyond and see bliss on the other side?
I think a lot of the misconceptions relate to ability, you know, where people would, for example, be nitpicking and cherry picking the types of disabilities that they will accommodate in their organization because they feel that certain types of disabilities might be inconvenient, for example. You know, so some of the misconceptions relate to maybe, you know, the ease of maybe having people that have albinism, you know, because they are fully functional. Or the assumption I heard at one stage a number of years ago in my career, someone actually saying there was a role open for a marketing specialist. And one of the people that was part of this recruitment team actually said, no, but we can't have a person with a disability because this person needs to put posters up. But is that the only requirement of a marketing specialist? Is that all they do? And that is such a small part of being a marketing specialist, where you are losing out on seeing the entire value of the individual.
And
all you can think, yes,
yeah.
You know, so those are just some of the misconceptions. And again, it was really just to educate and actually dispel those myths, you know, and educate to say, but this individual has got so much more potential. There are someone who's an honorary qualification with X number of years experience. Actually, it's our loss if we do not hire this individual.
And then we find that besides the choking, there's also misunderstanding on other aspects of inclusion, disability inclusion. Can you maybe articulate the cross-intersectionality of disability inclusion with the other DEI components as well as other universal access components or enablement that might even make it easier for companies to really approach it with everybody in mind.
Absolutely. So I often say that when we solve for one minority group, we indirectly solve for another one, and if we actually have intersectionality in our minds from the onset, and an example that I'll give is, for example, there might be someone who has a disability, she's a woman and she's in the pride community. If we are only focusing on one element, when we design our DEI programs, we're at risk of then losing out on the full aspect of this individual. Because if she feels included across all these elements of her identity, her sexuality, her gender, she really can then come to the organization, with her fullness, and contribute without fear of saying, maybe if I go too far around this, it's not in my place, So it's really, really critical that from the onset, when we are designing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, we actually have intersectionality, and that's how it then makes it so much easier for organizations, in terms of showing the relevant progress, because then it's not consistently a moving goalpost, but from the onset, your intention was to be as inclusive and as broad. I think what I'd encourage and really challenge corporate South Africa is moving the DEI discussion beyond race, ethnicity, and disability, and having a wide view. In the latest ISO DEI standards, there are actually 27 minority groups that need to be catered for in employee resource groups. So if we can say, let's start with 5, 6, 8, or 10, as we start as leaders, for example, the leaders that we spoke about, to say we want to create inclusive organizations, we just make the progress so much better for us, and the knock-on effect of each ERG and the programs that you're doing, what that then does in terms of just contributing to that richness of the tapestry that I spoke about.
And the usage of the intersectionality of disability inclusion with technology, maybe you can allude also to the movement towards AI and the relatively progressive changes in technology, which is almost a fast forward. Because if you really look, people don't understand that WhatsApp only came in 2016. Facebook was just, in 2004. And rapidly over the years, things are, and people don't question historically. Because if you look back, the first television to come to South Africa, maybe late 70s. The color television a few years later. But now it takes a day. I can give an example of Trump coming in recently and putting Twitter or X on trial. And the Chinese responded with Red Note immediately. We saw over 1 million Americans moving over to the platform. So in that regard, how can we leverage technology in the discourse of disability inclusion locally and as well as adopting from international practices, of course?
I think we're living in very, very exciting times, because technology can really be used as an equalizer, and I think I'll even take it as far beyond even just disability inclusion, but even the SDGs that I spoke about earlier on. The only way that we are going to make the necessary progress is by leveraging technology, So whether it's technology in the form of assistive devices, whether it's technology in the form of, there's a Cape Town-based company that actually uses 3D printing to develop prosthetics, So how do we leverage that and actually scale it, so that we are democratizing, access to to opportunities as well. how do we leverage artificial intelligence itself, to democratize access to education for people with disabilities? So the opportunities are imminent. And as you said, things are moving so fast, and one of the starting points, I think, for us, just as a nation as well, is maybe just starting with a AI strategy and an AI plan. How are we going to leverage artificial intelligence, to actually close our developmental gaps, including disability inclusion?
Yeah, I see when Accenture partnered with the National Council of and for Persons with Disabilities in their Casual Day, you guys developed a Casual Day sticker for them, which almost, brought another line of revenue. Maybe can you take us through that? Because it speaks to the intersectionality of inclusion and technology. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think also speaks to the heart of who we are as well, as a technology firm. So when lockdown happened, National Council was at the risk of even shutting their doors down, because Casual Day is their biggest fundraiser. And because we've been supporting Casual Day literally from 2014 when I joined, Accenture has been supporting Casual Day. But I personally, for over 20 years, have been working with this organization that does really phenomenal work around disability inclusion. Terina and the team reached out to me to say, we've got this challenge. And we then posed the challenge to our business. So our creative business, because we also have a digital business. And what we then did is we digitized the sticker. So the sticker is fully available and it's digital. And this was pro bono work that Accenture did. So National Council didn't pay Accenture for us to do it. We did it because we believe in the importance of disability inclusion and the work that they do. And in that same year, they pushed out Casual Day to December, but it was saved. And millions of people who benefit from those funds that they use to create change in communities benefited still from that support, including the staff of the National Council. So it's another example of, and I think it's another example of the spirit over form, and the intention. So because of the intentionality and the intention of inclusion, and not being about money and revenue and only about tick box. That's why we solved to say, how can we do this? And I often say that even within Accenture, the biggest contributor of an organization like an Accenture is actually leveraging who we truly are, our people, and even the promise of technology depends on human ingenuity. So how do you bring these two parts together, for the greater good of society?
Linking your focus, goal in society, but also doing the right thing with the human capital that you have.
Absolutely.
Yes, and you find that leaders who say, "Yes, I've given a yes, a go ahead, and we have put things in place in our company, but." How can we create a psychological safe environment for now people, the staff, to come forward and say in a safe space, I have a disability and I need this accommodation or this enablement? How can leaders do that? Because that's always the choking point as well, because people are scared.
Yeah.
They don't see the culture and it's something new.
Yeah.
How can we safely do that?
I think leaders leading by example, and vulnerability. And if you don't know, say you don't know, and ask and get educated, collaborate and partner with other organizations. So how psychological safety happens is in human spaces. We are human and we are hardwired for connection. And connection can only happen through vulnerability and connecting, even within organizations. So how do we bring back the human within organizations, so that people, and another example that I could give is around mental health, for example, for someone to actually disclose and say, I am struggling with my mental health, it has to be a psychologically safe environment where they know that it's not going to be used against them. And I think you're touching on another thing that I'm very passionate around, especially with males, and some of the work that we've done at Accenture around modern masculinity. what does modern masculinity look like in the workplace? Because that's how we create the vulnerability and the human space and the the psychological safe environments that even our male leaders, if they themselves are not leading by example to say, I struggle as well, I am human, and as soon as we also see that emotions are human, they're not feminine. That's how we make progress towards building that psychological safe environment and workspaces. And I think the last part is also just around, just to reiterate again, leadership commitment and the zero tolerance to bigotry, because it's one thing where the space might be, created. And if there are leaders that do and have behavior that is opposite to the values of the organization, how do we address it so that our people do actually see that if I raise a concern, the concern is dealt with and it doesn't fall on deaf ears, because that's how we then erode psychological safety.
And what would be the indicators that you suggest that they look out for as small victories, even if things look like they're bleak, in terms of the initiatives that they are taking in the disability inclusion?
Some of the basic things that you start to see is, in pulse surveys. Pulse surveys are very important indicators of a culture. So when you do the pulse surveys, you should actually track, what is the pulse survey saying? What did it say last year? Are we seeing progress in terms of our culture? Are we seeing reduced numbers, for example, maybe of misconduct issues being reported? Are we seeing a level of fun where people are relaxed and starting to feel comfortable in the organization? Because ultimately we are human and we spend a lot of time in the workplace, and I wouldn't want to go to a place where I'm a robot. So those are the small wins that you can start measuring and tracking, with regards to the organization. Some of the other elements, it's retention. How is our retention improving? Are we actually seeing long periods where people are staying with us? Because usually this one of the signs of organizations where there's a culture issue is the high levels of turnover of staff.
What would be your last word as a call to the corporate leaders in the South African context? Because obviously we are adopting some of these good practices globally, and we've taken that and watered it down to South African context. What would be your call to action, for this journey of disability inclusion as the world moves towards a convergent level?
I think for me it would be, start somewhere, and do not be overwhelmed with wanting to get everything right overnight. It's a journey, and start with the intention, collaborate and partner. Don't work in isolation, because the journey can become so much shorter if you leverage from other organizations, NPOs, other players, whether they're global or local, as we show the progress. Because if we also do get ourselves, I think, analysis paralysis, can actually delay progress, because we are so focused on wanting to perfect and boil the ocean, So it's start with the intention. And as I said, let the 2% be the initial start, even that 2%, with the view that it's not going to be achieved overnight.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate you joining us. As we've seen that we also almost bridging the gap between the global conversations and the local conversations, and we see we're not lagging far behind. It's just that the commitments needs to be made, and leaders need to take action and join initiatives like the Valuable 50 that's taking place soon. 100%. Details to be available, and we'll find this journey to be easygoing, and everybody will deal with the unemployment issues for everybody in South Africa, except because we have a high number of youth unemployment. And thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate and all the best with your new company.
Thank you so much for having me.